and stamping in pieces all others. And in the days of the Roman Empire, you didn't mess with the Roman army. They were renowned for their ferocity, their incredible discipline. There's all sorts of stories of how a limited number of Roman soldiers held back vast armies. There was one army coming down a narrow pass, and there was about 300 Roman soldiers, and they stood there right across the narrow pass with the high cliff walls on either side. They had the long shields that covered the whole body, and there they stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, and they were like an impenetrable wall. And if any of them got injured or killed, the colleagues pulled them out of the way and stepped right up with another lot of shield filling that area. And in the end, the army that had come down the pass had to retreat because it could not break through the strict discipline of the Roman soldiers. Interesting things. In fact, Paul's description of the army of the Christian is modelled on the army of the Romans. He has some Old Testament license for interpreting that. Some of the elements of armour are actually described in the Old Testament, but Paul built on it, using it as a word picture, and he spoke about the various aspects of the armour. When he speaks of the shield, and the Romans had different kinds of shields, but when he says lift up the shield of faith, the one he's talking about is that big long one that covered the whole body. No good having one of those little ones. The Greek word used in Ephesians chapter 6 is not the word for that little one, it's the word for the big one. Of course, you don't know that until you check up a commentary or whatever, and you find out the particular detail that Paul is trying to bring out. And then he speaks about, with that shield of faith, you can quench all the flaming missiles of the wicked one. What's he talking about? Well, the Romans had a habit of getting some of their armed men, that's the ones with the bow and arrows, of dipping the arrow in pitch and then dipping it in the fire, setting fire to the pitch, and then firing the arrow. So that's why he calls it the flaming missile. It comes and it would land. It would burn people it touched. It would land on buildings and set them afire, which would throw confusion into the ranks of the enemy, and so on like that. And spiritually, that's exactly what Satan likes to do. He tries to do that sort of thing. Flaming missiles, and can I be a bit cheeky here? It reminds me of the days we live in with websites and texting and all that kind of thing, where there are flaming missiles of a kind never envisaged by Paul, but we live in days like that, where out of the blue, as it were, come these statements on the internet or texting or whatever that can spread rumours. In fact, the false cults and false religions have had a heyday since the internet was invented. All those false beliefs have been able to proliferate all through the world at an alarming rate, never ever envisaged before, except about God who knew all things and said that knowledge would increase in the last days. And then at the very bottom of the statue is these 10 toes. Now I need to say to you, if the Babylonian kingdom was prophesied of by that vision, and it came and it went, if the Medes and Persians, symbolized by the 2 arms, and it was a dual kingdom, Media, Persia, it came and it went. We're dealing here with several hundred years. And then we have the Greeks, and that went on for several hundred years. That came and went. And then the Romans, that went on for several hundred years. See, we're dealing here with a vast scope of human history. And the Bible talks about the times of the Gentiles, right? Let's test the class here. Can you give me a couple of references in the New Testament where the times of the Gentiles, that phrase, is used?
Didn't like the Jews get something at the time of the Gentiles had passed? Didn't
Yes.
the Jews get something or something like
Yes,
that?
what you're probing at is in Romans, all right? So for those of you who are thinking that, oh good, I'll give the Romans 11 reference, that's already taken. Thank you, Charlie. Come on, what's wrong with you adults? You've got the children giving these wonderful, wonderful answers here.
Paul speaks of the gospel being the power of God to change the hearts of first the Jew, then the Gentile.
No, I won't accept that one in this context.
Good try though.
Gentiles will trample the courtyard.
Yes, that one I hadn't thought of. I will accept that. There's one that Jesus made. That's a clue.
Matthew 24.
Can you quote? Without looking at it?
At the end.
What's on your mind, Margaret? Spell it out.
No, just the end of, just that phrase. I haven't got it in its context.
Yeah, Jesus did make a remark about that as well. So, you see, the fact that God speaks about the times of the Gentiles, as well as prophecies he makes about regathering Israel in the last days, God's got his mind on the whole world. That's what I'm trying to bring out here, a global world view. God has not abandoned his world. He's got a process and plan in mind, and we will particularly see that when we start looking at the second section about what the second coming means to the nation of Israel. And as you look at United Nations, for instance, and some people have wisely said United Nations means united nothing. United Nations representing the Gentile nations, except for Israel, of course, they have got an agenda. The Jewish people, God has an agenda for. God's going to deal with both. And that's why the study on the second coming of Christ is so relevant to the times in which we live. So at the very end of these Gentile things, because it affects the Gentile nations, that statue vision, there's these 10 toes, partly iron, so they are partly from the Roman Empire because the legs were of iron. That's the symbolism of the vision, so stick to the symbolism. But they're partly of clay, partly strong, partly weak. Some people say partly democratic, partly totalitarian. Well, say whatever you like there, but there's these 10 toes. Revelation talks about 10 kings that will arise at the very end, and just for a very short period, less than the times and half the time, 42 months, 1,260 days, which are all the same thing, are spoken of in the reign of the Antichrist. These kings arise and they give their vote to the Antichrist. He rules over them and they help his agendas. It arises out of the old Roman Empire, and it's a very interesting time. Europe has not yet come to that period of time yet. Can events change quickly in European nations? Yes. What's your reason for saying that?
Because of just changes happening, like people have different ideas and different people come along, different things happen. Just
It's very interesting listening to you. This is an 11-year-old.
Because the countries were surrounded by other countries.
Yes. Did any of us ever think 2 years ago that Britain would be leaving the European Union?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Well, some might do. All right, Margaret.
Having lived there for a short time.
Yes, okay.
World War II.
Huge changes. Did any of us ever think that the Iron Curtain would fall in the way it did? Where there was no fight, God brought a Gorbachev into leadership in Russia, who promoted his policy of glasnost and toned down the military rhetoric. God used President Reagan to ramp up nuclear weapon production, which forced Russia to do the same and virtually bankrupted Russia. It's also caused devastation in American finance. They are trillions of dollars in debt. Financially, they are a sick country. They still have the military might, which Obama boasted about. We have the strongest armies in the world. Well, when a nation starts to boast about its might, they have forgotten about God. How many times have great empires collapsed? We've just been talking about them. The Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Yeah.
The Americans indebtedness is to China.
Yes, China and Saudi Arabia have huge amounts of money invested in America, and if both those countries were to pull all their money out, America financially would collapse. It would go down. I have a contact who keeps track of these things with persistence, and he said that China and Russia are building up their gold reserves. They were returning to the gold standard. America they shifted off it, and then people are asking, where was the gold that we formerly had? It's all disappeared. The Reserve Bank in America is not owned by the government. Our Reserve Bank is. But America's Reserve Bank is an independent entity, and the government of America borrows of this independent entity. And you're saying, what? Aren't the Americans in charge of their own finances? No, not ultimately. You say, well, that makes me feel awkward, uneasy about the world in which I live. Point taken. All right. Yes.
When we were travelling in Europe, it became very evident that as soon as a nation lost its king, or its royalty, its kingdomness, that nation declined very, very rapidly.
Yes.
Like Russia lost her Tsars, downslide, France, guillotine, down the slippery slope, and the nations disappeared very, very quickly as soon as they abolished their.
Well, these are the old issues of leadership, of course. If you destroy your leaders, you'll usually replace it, or quite often, with something inferior. And what's new about history? I've always been interested in history because behind it, and knowing the Bible, behind it, I can see the hand of God in world affairs. When I listen to the news sometimes, I think to myself, thank you, Lord, you're in charge of this thing, and a few years further on, the thing that looked so horrible has disappeared from the human stage. You see, God's in charge. I did history and school certificate and university entrance, and there were people that in the 1800s that wanted to make Europe one united entity. It kept collapsing, even though great leaders of their day rose up and tried to make it happen, great armies to back it. It just never came into fruition, because there's a God above who just knows how to lean on things until their perfect time comes into being for fulfillment. Even Antichrist, he's only able to have 3.5 years. I mean, we would all say that's too much, but the fact of the matter is that he's on a leash. He's on a leash. God can use the powers of darkness to fulfill his ultimate goal, while the powers of darkness are thinking they're having a field day. I mean, look at the story of Job. Satan thought he was going to win, but God put a leash on him. You can take all his things, but don't touch him. Second round, You can afflict his body, but you're not to take his life. Was Satan on a leash? Absolutely. Absolutely. Don't be troubled by news that you hear. In fact, Jesus said, you'll hear of wars and rumours of wars and everything else. See that you be not troubled. So we who are believers need to discipline ourselves to come into alignment with a divine global point of view. And thank God he has a global point of view, and he will eventually send Jesus Christ to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I heard Bob Mumford describing this at one of Des Short's conventions in Tauranga many years ago. He said one translation of this is King of those kinging it and Lord of those lording it. American presidents have virtually had more authority than many kings. It's just on points of their origins that America doesn't want a king and queen. The closest people that ever came to looking to that like that would have been the Kennedys a way back, but look what happened there, and so forth. So when you look at world history, don't look at it away from the scriptures and so forth.
I think that's what's called his story, history.
Yes, he's referring to history, which if you split it is his story. God's in charge. All right, interesting to talk about this. In that vision, and I'm finishing up with this, Charlie, as Daniel watched, he saw a stone come from heaven. It was not made with human hands. It came and it hit the image, which caused it to collapse and break. That stone then proceeded to grind in pieces all the remnants of all those metals represented. And that stone ground it so fine that the wind could blow the metal away like dust, like the sand on the sand dunes. And then the stone grew and filled everything. And Daniel said, in the days of those kings of the 10 toes, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never pass away. And so in the kingdom that Christ has, it's not going to have Roman remnants, it's not going to have Grecian remnants, it's not going to have any of that, because all of that is ground to dust and goes away in the vision. It's going to be a different kingdom on God's own values. Hallelujah. See, and I'm talking about fine detail, you see. Fine detail. Daniel noted all this and he described it. I've had people, as I said much earlier, that would tell me about their dream or vision. And I would listen very carefully, and then they'd say, what is its meaning? I said, you had too many onions for tea. Because it didn't make sense. There was the lack of biblical sequence, detail. It just didn't make sense. And if you look at Bible visions and the interpretation written out for us to read, every little detail is there. Can we just go back to Daniel? In much later years, he had a second vision and he saw 4 great beasts, wild beasts. Not the glory of the statue, but he saw the ferocious nature. And the same kingdoms that were there in the statue vision are there now in terms of the wild animals. I want to come to the last one, which was described as great and terrible. And this was the Roman Empire. And on its head there were 10 horns, which in the interpretation are 10 kings. And after they were there arose another horn that came up after them and plucked 3 of them up by the roots. So that's violent overthrow. Is that how you'd interpret plucking a thing up by the roots? Violent overthrow. And the other 7 then submitted. That little horn is the Antichrist. He doesn't come on the scene until the 10 kings are in place. Now we haven't yet come to that period yet. Fascinating, isn't it? And so on. All right, I think
So
I've...
you mean historically in time we haven't come?
Yes, though historically in time, that's still ahead of us.
That's still there.
I mean, Antichrist isn't yet ruling. When he does, he's going to be a tyrant. He's got a false prophet, and the false prophet is the one who executes people who won't give worship to the beast. I'm not saying this is the correct interpretation, but I read once, someone said, is the false prophet a Muslim? Fascinating, isn't it? I'd never thought of that before. But a large number of nations are Muslim. Who would persuade them to worship the beast? Unless they had a major say-so in the overall scheme of things. If the false prophet is a Muslim and they are looking for their Messiah, as the previous president of Iran publicly said numerous times, our goal is to get rid of Israel to prepare the way for the Mahdi to come. That's their Messiah. Now that man is no longer the president, but that was his great goal. That was one of the reasons they wanted to develop nuclear power, to send those bombs into Israel and destroy them. And Muslims don't care if other Muslims are destroyed in the process. With them, the end justifies the means. We see plenty of that all around the world. Look what's happening in Gaza. They don't mind if many of their people are killed by Israeli border guards, as long as they can embarrass Israel and ultimately get what they want. They can promise paradise to all their martyrs and everything else. This is how they go on. So Iran would have no problems destroying a lot of Muslims in the process, as long as they got what they want. And then you've got the strife between Muslim Shiites and Muslim Sunnis, and so on. Some of you don't follow world events very closely, I can tell by looking at your faces. Others of you are listening away there and saying, all right, how are we going here? First hour is up.